Picture this. A man steps down from a travel-worn carriage after 5 years away, dust still clinging to his boots, and the first thing he hears is not his name spoken in shock, not a scream, not a sob of relief. He hears laughter. Warm, easy, unhurried laughter, coming from a woman he once called his wife, directed at another man entirely. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when the past comes back expecting an apology it never earned, stay with me, because this is one of those stories. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight, and if you believe some doors should stay closed no matter how grand the man knocking on them is. Leave a like before we begin, because the Duke of Ashworth is about to learn that 5 years is a very long time to keep a woman waiting who finally stopped waiting. 5 years earlier, Ilara Whitmore had not yet learned to stop waiting. She had spent the better part of a decade waiting for her husband to look at her the way he had looked at her once, briefly, in the weeks before their wedding, when he still believed she might be more than an arrangement stitched together by two families in need of each other's money and name. Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth, had married her for the modest fortune her father had built in trade, and the respectability her family's old, threadbare title still commanded in rooms where money alone could not buy a seat. Ilara had married him because at 19 she had believed, foolishly, that duty and devotion were the same thing, and that if she gave enough of the second, the household would eventually supply her with some of the first. It did not. Ashworth House was cold in every way a house can be cold. Its halls were long and handsome and draughty, hung with the portraits of Ashworth ancestors who all seemed, to Ilara's eye, to be regarding her with the same faint appraising scepticism the living relations offered at Christmas. The servants were kind to her in private and correct to her in public, sensing before she did that her position was never as secure as her title suggested. Julian was polite at breakfast and absent by supper, and increasingly, as the years passed, absent by breakfast as well. Ilara filled the silence the way women in her position were taught to fill it, with needlework, with correspondence, with the quiet management of an estate whose books she understood better than the steward who kept them, though no one asked her opinion, and she had learned not to offer it. There was a particular evening, in the 3rd year of the marriage, when she had waited in the good parlour with supper gone cold twice over, listening for the sound of his horse on the drive, and had finally blown out the candles herself and gone up to bed alone, and understood, lying awake in the dark, that she had stopped truly expecting him some time before she had admitted it to herself. She did not weep that night either. She simply made a private accounting, the way she made every other accounting in that house, and marked the marriage down, quietly, as a debt that would likely never be repaid. She was by then very good at being invisible in a house that bore her name on every deed and none of her preferences in a single room. The trouble had a name, and the name was Seraphina Vane. Lady Seraphina was everything Ilara had never been permitted to become, glittering, sharp-tongued, adored at every assembly she deigned to attend, and utterly without shame about wanting things that belonged to other people. She had set her sights on Julian before his marriage, and had never quite released them afterward. And Julian, starved for the kind of easy admiration his own wife had long since stopped offering him because it was never asked for, had let himself be caught. Ilara knew before the household did. She always knew before anyone told her. It was, perhaps, the one advantage of being ignored, she noticed everything, because no one thought to notice her noticing. She had confronted Seraphina only once, at a garden party the summer before the end, drawing the other woman aside with a composure that cost her more than anyone watching could have guessed. "I would ask you to leave my husband be," Ilara had said, quietly enough that no passing guest would overhear. "Not for my sake, which I suspect means nothing to you, but because you will find, when you have finally worn him down to nothing, that there is very little left worth having." Seraphina had only smiled, the particular smile of a woman who has never once been told no and did not intend to start believing it now. "You mistake me for someone who wants him for keeping," she had said. "I want him for having. There's a difference, though I don't expect a woman who reads ledgers for pleasure to understand it." Ilara had walked away from that conversation with no illusions left about what was coming, only a grim, useless clarity, the kind that arrives too late to change anything and simply sits in the chest like a stone. What she had not expected was the manner of her ending. She had imagined, in her darker hours, a quiet estrangement, separate households, a discreet arrangement of the kind other unhappy couples of their rank managed with tight-lipped dignity. What she received instead was a public unmaking. Julian's solicitor, a narrow, ambitious man named Aldous Renner, who had attached himself to the Duke's affairs some years prior and made himself indispensable in ways no one had thought to examine too closely, produced a ledger. The ledger showed in painstaking and entirely fabricated detail that funds from the estate's charitable trust, funds meant for tenant relief during a hard winter, had been diverted through accounts bearing Ilara's signature. It was a lie built with enough true details stitched around it to be believed, and it was presented not privately, not gently, but at a dinner attended by 40 of the county's most important families, so that by the time Ilara understood what was happening to her, it had already happened in front of everyone whose good opinion she would ever need again. "I believe," Renner had said, laying the ledger open beside the soup course with the mild, regretful air of a man performing an unpleasant duty, "that the Duchess has been rather less careful with the tenants' relief fund than her position required." He had looked to Julian as he said it, not to Ilara, and Julian, who had spent a fortnight by then already half persuaded by Seraphina's careful, sorrowful hints that something was amiss in the household accounts, had not looked to his wife either, had not asked her, even once, whether the numbers on the page bore any resemblance to the truth. "Is this so, Ilara?" was all he managed, and she remembered afterward that he had used her given name in front of 40 guests, as though the formality of her title were already a courtesy he could no longer extend her. She had answered him honestly and precisely, laying out exactly why the figures could not be hers, and watched the room decide, in the space of a held breath, that a woman's calm was proof of guilt and a man's discomfort was proof of nothing at all. She did not cry. She remembered that clearly afterward how strange it had felt not to cry, as though some part of her had already known this moment was coming and had spent its grief in advance. She rose from the table, thanked her hostess for the evening with a composure that would later be described by witnesses as either remarkably dignified or chillingly cold, depending on which side of the room they had been sitting, and left Ashworth House before dawn with a single trunk and no maid, because she would not ask a servant to choose a side that might cost them their position. Julian did not come after her. Julian, in fact, married no one in the 5 years that followed, kept Seraphina as his acknowledged companion in everything but name, and let the county believe whatever version of the story suited its appetite for scandal. Ilara went to Belhaven, a market town 3 counties distant, where no one had heard of the Duchess of Ashworth, and fewer still would have cared. She called herself Mrs. Hale, a widow of modest means, and took a small cottage on the edge of the town with what remained of an inheritance from her mother that Julian's family had never known to look for. She did not intend to build anything. She intended, if she was honest with herself in those first hollow months, simply to survive the humiliation without dying of it, which felt at the time like ambition enough. But survival, it turned out, required occupation, and occupation for a woman who had spent a decade quietly running an estate no one credited her with running was not difficult to find. Belhaven's small textile mill was failing under an owner who understood machinery and nothing else, and Ilara, Mrs. Hale, began by offering, almost apologetically, a suggestion about the ledgers that saved the man 3 months of near-certain ruin. One suggestion became a standing arrangement. A standing arrangement became, within 2 years, a partnership, and within 4, an enterprise entirely her own, a weaving works that paid its workers fairly, kept its accounts honestly, and had begun, by the winter this story properly begins, to draw notice from merchants as far as the coast. There was a morning, not long after the weaving works had begun properly to turn a profit, when one of her weavers, a widow named Susan Croft with 3 children and a cough that worsened every winter, came to her in the small office at the back of the mill, twisting her apron in her hands, to confess she had fallen short on the rent owed for her cottage and expected, from long habit with other employers, to be dismissed for it. Ilara had simply opened the ledger, adjusted the woman's wages forward against future work rather than punishing her for the present shortfall, and told her plainly that a mill that could not keep its own people through a hard month was not a mill worth running. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing no one at Ashworth House would have noticed had she done it there. But word of it moved through Belhaven the way such things do in small towns, quietly and completely. And within a year Mrs. Hale was spoken of not merely as a competent businesswoman, but as a fair one, which in that town, among people who had rarely been treated fairly by anyone above them, was a rarer and more valuable reputation to hold. It was in the 2nd year of this quiet reinvention that Gideon Marsh arrived in Belhaven, and it was Gideon who taught her, without either of them naming it as a lesson, that a woman could be seen and valued for exactly who she was and nothing more. He came as a land agent, hired to survey and manage a neighbouring estate whose absent owner had let it fall into disrepair. And he arrived with none of the polish Ilara had spent a decade learning to expect from men of consequence, and none of the indifference she had learned to expect from men without it. He wore his coat like a man who had actually worked in it. He asked her opinion on drainage and crop rotation and, later, on the mill's accounts, and listened to her answers as though they were the point of the conversation rather than a courtesy extended before the conversation's real business began. He did not know she had once been a duchess. He knew Mrs. Hale, a sharp-guarded widow who ran her business better than most men ran theirs, and who laughed, rarely but completely, when she forgot to guard herself. He did not tell her, either, for a long while, that Gideon Marsh was not entirely the whole of his name. that his mother had been the younger sister of an earl with no living son, that the estate he managed so unassumingly was in fact held in trust for him, and that he had spent 3 years working as a common land agent precisely because he had grown suspicious. After one bitter engagement broken the moment his fortunes had briefly seemed uncertain of anyone who liked him before they knew what he was worth. He told Ilara the truth of it on a spring evening a full year after they had met, half expecting the warmth to leave her face the way it always had in others once the numbers changed. Instead, she had simply said, after a long moment, that it explained why he never flinched at hard work, had asked whether the earldom came with a decent library, and he had laughed. Really laughed. For what he told her afterward was the first time in 3 years, and understood that he had, without intending to, fallen entirely and permanently in love with a woman who had never once cared what he was called. She did not tell him, in turn, what she had been called. Not yet. There was a particular kind of peace in being only Mrs. Hale, in being loved for a self she had built with her own hands rather than a title stitched onto her at 19 by other people's ambitions, and she found she was not ready to surrender it, even to him. He did not press her. He had his own reasons for understanding the value of a name kept quiet, and he let her keep hers, trusting correctly that whatever she was protecting herself from, it was not him. They took to walking the mill road together in the evenings, once the looms had gone quiet, past hedgerows silvering with frost and later, as the seasons turned, thick with the smell of hawthorn. And it was on one of these walks, in the deep cold of a second winter, that Gideon told her, haltingly, about the engagement he had broken off years before. A woman who had professed to love him entirely, until a rumour of his family's debts had reached her before the truth of his eventual inheritance did, and who had returned his letters within the week. "I have been careful ever since," he admitted, watching his own boots rather than her face, about which parts of myself I show a person before I know what they're keeping the rest of me for. Ilara had said nothing for a long moment, only reached over and taken his arm properly, the way she had not quite let herself do before, and told him that she understood the particular exhaustion of being loved for the wrong reasons better than he might imagine, though she did not yet explain why. It was, she would think later, the moment the two of them stopped merely liking each other's company and began, quietly and without ceremony, to belong to one another. It might have stayed that way indefinitely, a slow and steady courtship built on honest work and unhurried evenings, had Ashworth House not begun, in its owner's long absence of attention, to collapse under the weight of the very corruption that had once been used to destroy his wife. Aldous Renner, it transpired, had not confined his talents for fabrication to a single ledger 5 years prior. Freed of the one person in the household clever enough to have eventually caught him, he had spent 5 years quietly bleeding the Ashworth estate through false accounts, inflated repairs, and rents collected twice over and recorded once, while Julian, distracted first by Seraphina and then, as her interest cooled along with his usefulness to her, by a slow and comfortless drift through a marriage he had never actually ended in law, noticed nothing beyond the increasingly uncomfortable letters from his bank. Seraphina left him in the 4th year, for a wealthier and less encumbered prospect, with the particular cruelty of someone who had never loved the man so much as the position she'd hoped he would eventually free up for her. Julian spent the 5th year alone in a house that had begun, in every practical sense, to fail around him, and it was only when Rena's thefts grew too large to disguise even from a distracted man that Julian finally opened the books himself and understood, with a slowness that shamed him more than the discovery itself, precisely how much he had thrown away and how little he had ever actually looked at. He came to Belhaven in autumn, 5 years almost to the week after the dinner that had ended his marriage in every way but the legal one, because a former steward of his, dismissed for questioning Rena too loudly and hired since by the mill Ilara had built, had written to say, cautiously, that he believed he had seen the former Duchess alive and well and prospering under another name. Julian told himself he came for the estate's sake, that a man in his position needed to account for a wife still legally his own before he could untangle the mess Rena had made of everything else. He told himself several things on the road to Belhaven, most of them designed to avoid admitting that he had thought of Ilara's composed, unweeping face at that dinner table more often in 5 years than he had ever admitted to himself, and that some unexamined part of him had always assumed she would still be waiting somewhere, preserved, for him to eventually deserve finding her again. He arrived at the mill on a bright, ordinary afternoon, and found her in the yard, ledger in hand, deep in an argument with Gideon Marsh about the price of coal that was clearly, from the ease between them, not really an argument at all, and she laughed at something Gideon said. A full, unguarded laugh, Julian realized, with a jolt he had never once heard from her in 10 years of marriage, and it was that laugh, more than anything Rena had stolen. That told Julian exactly how much he had lost, and exactly how little claim he still had to reclaim it. He stood at the edge of the yard for a long moment before either of them noticed him, watching the woman he had married and never quite seen move through her own world with an ease and authority Ashworth House had never once allowed her. Workers nodding to her as they passed with the particular respect of people who have been treated fairly and know it, and he understood, even before she turned and recognized him, that whatever version of Ilara he had come to find, she no longer existed. Because the woman standing in that mill yard was someone entirely new, built from 5 years he had played no part in whatsoever. The yard fell quiet around them the way yards do when the workers sense, without being told, that something larger than coal prices is unfolding. Gideon's hand had gone, instinctively and without calculation, to rest near the small of Ilara's back, not quite touching her, a question rather than a claim, and Ilara had not stepped away from it, which told Julian everything the conversation that followed only confirmed at greater length. Ilara, her name in his mouth, was the first thing he said, and he watched her go entirely still, the ledger lowering slowly to her side, 5 years of careful reinvention meeting 5 years of overdue reckoning in a single instant across a mill yard full of workers who had no idea their misses. Hale had once been a duchess, your grace. Her voice, when it came, was even, almost gentle, and somehow that was worse than anger would have been. You've come a very long way to discover I no longer require finding. He had rehearsed, on the long road north, several versions of what he might say, apology, explanation, an appeal to the marriage that still bound them on paper, whatever it had ceased to mean in fact. What came out instead, in front of Gideon and a yard full of workers, was clumsier and truer than anything rehearsed. I was wrong. About all of it. I should have looked at you the way I'm looking at you now, years ago, when it would have mattered. It would have mattered 5 years ago, Ilara agreed, and there was no cruelty in it, only a fact laid down like a stone. It doesn't now. That evening, after the mill had emptied and Gideon had walked her home along the frost-hardened road without once asking the question she could see sitting behind his eyes, Ilara sat a long while by her own small fire, turning the day over in her hands like an unfamiliar coin. She had imagined this moment more times than she cared to admit in 5 years of telling herself she had stopped imagining it at all. The Duke returned, contrite, asking to be taken back, and had always assumed in the privacy of those imaginings that some old and stubborn part of her would want it, however briefly. She found, sitting by the fire with Gideon's coat still faintly warm across her shoulders where he had draped it before leaving, that the part of her she had braced herself against simply was not there anymore. It was not that she had forgiven Julian in that instant, and it was certainly not that she had forgotten what his household had done to her. It was only that the ground he had once stood on in her life had long since been built over with something sturdier, and there was in the end no room left to excavate. Gideon asked her the question the following morning plainly, over tea that had gone cold between them because neither of them had thought to drink it. "Do you still love him?" Not unkindly, not as an accusation, simply as a man who had learned the hard way that a question asked directly was kinder than one left to fester unspoken. Ilara had answered him as plainly as he'd asked it. "I grieved that marriage long before I ever left Ashworth House, Gideon. What I felt yesterday wasn't love returning. It was a debt finally being paid that I'd stopped expecting to collect." He had studied her face for a long moment, the particular searching look of a man checking a wound to see whether it was closing properly, and then, apparently satisfied, had simply nodded and asked whether she took sugar, which she did not, and never had. And he knew that perfectly well, and it made her laugh despite herself, and that, more than any declaration, was what told her the ground beneath them had held. He did not leave. That was perhaps the one thing Julian did correctly in the whole unhappy chapter. He stayed in Belhaven, took a room at the inn, and set about the slower, less flattering work of untangling what Renner had done, both to his estate and, he came to understand with growing shame, to his wife's name 5 years prior. Because the deeper he dug into the false ledger that had ended his marriage, the more clearly its methods matched the fresher fraud currently gutting his finances. It was the same hand. It had always been the same hand. And Julian had been too dazzled by Seraphina and too incurious about his own house to ever ask the question that would have saved his marriage. Whose signature actually authorized these transfers, and why had no one but his wife ever thought to check? Gideon, for his part, felt the ground shift beneath a courtship he had believed steady, and to his credit. Ilara would say later it was the moment she stopped merely loving him and started trusting him completely. He did not demand she prove her loyalty or explain herself in a hurry. He asked her once, plainly, whether she still loved the Duke, and when she answered, just as plainly, that she had grieved the marriage long before she left it, and had not carried a single unresolved feeling for Julian into Belhaven, only the scar of what his household had done to her, Gideon believed her. Because he had spent a lifetime learning to recognize the difference between people who dressed up their feelings for effect, and a woman who had never once, in 2 years of knowing him, bothered to perform anything at all. The investigation Julian began alone became, within weeks, an investigation the whole of Belhaven had a hand in. because Renner's fraud had not confined its damage to Ashworth House. Tenants who had been quietly overcharged for repairs never made came forward once they understood someone with standing was finally listening. A clerk at the county bank, long uneasy about certain transfers he had processed without ever being told their true purpose, produced records he had privately preserved against exactly this day, having grown suspicious enough of Renner's instructions some years back that he had, on a hunch he could never quite justify to himself, begun keeping a private duplicate of every entry that crossed his desk under the solicitor's name. The dismissed steward who had first written to Julian supplied dates and names going back years, sitting with Julian for 3 long evenings at the Belhaven Inn to walk through every repair invoice he could still recall being told to falsify. And it was during the second of these evenings that Julian, for what he would later admit was the first time in his adult life, sat and listened to a man beneath his own station speak for hours, without once interrupting him. Gideon, for his part, contributed something Julian could never have supplied alone. The quiet, patient trust of the tenants and small landholders across 3 counties who had learned over 2 years to speak plainly to their land agent, and who now came forward with their own smaller grievances against Renner's schemes, each one a single loose thread that, gathered together, became rope enough to hang the man properly. And Ilara, who had kept, out of old habit and older suspicion, copies of the very ledgers Renner had once used to destroy her, because some quiet, unbroken part of her had never quite believed the matter was finished, produced the single piece of evidence that closed the circle entirely. Proof, in Renner's own hand, misfiled and forgotten in a duplicate ledger he had never thought anyone would think to compare against the original, that the funds supposedly diverted through her signature 5 years earlier had in fact flowed directly into an account bearing his own. She had kept those pages for 5 years without ever quite admitting to herself why. Folded into the bottom of the same trunk she had carried out of Ashworth House in the dark, and there was a grim, private satisfaction in finally understanding that the instinct which had made her keep them was not paranoia after all, but the same careful attentiveness that had made her so good and so invisible at running a household no one had ever thought to credit her with running. The reckoning, when it came the way these things tend to come in a county that loves nothing so much as a scandal it can watch resolve into justice, publicly, at the autumn assembly, before nearly every family who had sat at that dinner table 5 years earlier and watched a young Duchess walk out into the dark without a single voice raised in her defence. The room had gone very quiet when Julian rose, the particular quiet of a crowd that senses it is about to be given a story it will repeat for years, and quieter still when the county magistrate, seated near the front at Julian's own invitation, confirmed aloud that formal charges against Aldous Renner had already been laid on the strength of evidence gathered these past weeks. Julian, to the surprise of a room that had expected him to defend his own name above all else, stood first, and did not spare himself. He told them plainly that his wife had been innocent of everything she was accused of, that the true thief stood exposed by his own hand in documents now with the county magistrate, and that whatever judgment the room wished to pass on the Duke of Ashworth for his blindness, his vanity, and his 5 wasted years, he would accept it without complaint, because he had earned every part of it. I had a wife who managed my household better than I managed anything in my life, he told them, and I let a liar and my own vanity convince me to throw her into the dark rather than ask her a single honest question. I will not ask this room to forgive me for it. I ask only that you finally see her clearly, since I took 5 years to manage it myself. A murmur moved through the assembled families. The particular murmur of people recalculating, in real time, exactly how they intended to describe this evening in their letters the following morning. Renner, arrested that same week on evidence too complete to dispute, would face the county courts and, eventually, transportation. Stripped of the respectability he had spent a decade building on other people's ruin, and it was said afterward that not one family in the county troubled themselves to write a character reference on his behalf, though several had done so freely enough 5 years earlier when it was Ilara's character in question instead. Ilara did not need to defend herself at all. The room did it for her, the way rooms like that always eventually do once the wind changes, with the particular fervour of people eager to prove they had never truly doubted her, though the assembly's own memory told a different story. She accepted their sudden warmth with the same even composure she had once used to survive their coldness, neither cruel about it, nor especially moved, because she had long since stopped needing that room's good opinion to know her own worth. What she wanted, when Julian finally asked her, quietly, near the end of that long evening, whether there was any way forward for them now that the truth was known and his name restored, was simple, and she gave it to him without cruelty and without hesitation. I forgive you, Julian, because carrying the alternative would cost me more than it would ever cost you. But forgiveness isn't the same as return. I built a life you had no hand in and no claim to, with a man who never once needed a title to know what I was worth, and I have no intention of trading it for the one you finally remembered you wanted. The legal end of the marriage, uncontested now on every point that mattered, followed within months, quietly and without further scandal, because Julian, whatever his failures, had at least learned enough by then not to make her leaving harder than her staying once had been. She married Gideon the following spring, in Belhaven, among the workers of the mill she had built and the tenants he had spent years quietly looking after, in a ceremony with none of the grandeur of her first wedding and all of the warmth it had lacked. He was, by then, properly the earl his uncle's death had made him, though neither of them much cared for the title beyond what it allowed them to do for the people around them, and Ilara ran the estate's affairs at his side exactly as she had always been capable of running them, only now with someone beside her who had never once needed her to be smaller than she was. Julian rebuilt Ashworth House, slowly and without the mistress or the marriage he had once assumed were owed to him, into something more honest than it had ever been under his careless stewardship. He reinstated the tenant relief fund Renner had gutted twice over, this time keeping the ledgers open to any tenant who wished to inspect them. A small and belated penance that fooled no one into thinking it repaid the larger debt, but which he kept up faithfully all the same year after year, because it was the one useful thing left within his power to do. He wrote to Ilara once more, the following winter, not to ask for anything but simply to tell her that the mistake he regretted most was never Seraphina at all, but the 10,000 smaller mistakes of a man who had simply never bothered to ask his own wife a single question about herself, and that he hoped, wherever she had landed, someone was finally asking her plenty. She read the letter once, folded it carefully, and did not answer it, not out of cruelty. but because some doors are kinder left simply closed than reopened for one final tidy word. If he never again found the particular kind of love he had thrown away, he found at least the harder and rarer thing of learning what he had lost in time to stop losing anything more. Serafina, for what it is worth, married twice more in the years that followed, each time for exactly the reasons she had always married, and found each time that the reasons ran out before the marriage did, until she settled, eventually, into a fashionable and friendless middle age that suited, in its way, exactly what she had always actually wanted. The mill in Belhaven grew, in time, into 3 mills, and the earldom Gideon had once worn as reluctantly as a borrowed coat became, under the 2 of them together, the kind of estate other landholders sent their sons to study rather than the kind they quietly pitied. They had 2 children, a girl who inherited her mother's unhurried attentiveness to a ledger, and a boy who inherited his father's inability to walk past a struggling tenant without stopping to help. And neither child was raised to believe for even a single day that their worth had anything whatsoever to do with what they were called. Ilara told them the whole of her story eventually, when they were old enough to understand it properly, not as a tale of a wronged Duchess rescued by a good man, but as something plainer and, she thought, more useful, the story of a woman who had once believed her value depended entirely on being chosen, and who had learned in a market town 3 counties from everything she'd lost, that the only choosing that ever mattered was the choice she made afterward to build something true with her own 2 hands. And Ilara, Mrs. Hale to some, the Countess to others, and the Duchess who got away to a county that had once been so quick to abandon her, kept the one lesson Belhaven had taught her closer than any title ever could, that the love worth keeping is the kind that finds you when you have nothing left to offer but yourself, and stays anyway, because it was never after anything else to begin with.